Testing 1, 2, 3. Much like a father who has come back after getting milk 3 years later, I am now coming back to you, my YouTube children. Yeah, a lot of changes. We'll get into those eventually. But first, I just wanted to talk about some very interesting stuff kind of going on in the tech for good sphere. I don't know how much you guys have context on this, so I will give a little bit of an overview of this organization, and then you guys can kind of skip around and essentially go through the introduction to get to my thoughts. But essentially, I wanted to discuss today the state of tech for good funding and a big issue that I'm seeing in so many different organizations and spheres, and in spheres. It's something that kind of came up today out of many days because one of the nonprofits that was very impactful in my general tech for good journey has unfortunately decided to shut down. And I think something that's very interestingly happening in the kind of tech for good space is that, you know, as of right now, apps are being built at a super fast clip. More websites, apps, general pieces of software are being deployed more than ever. It seems like there's legitimately no boundaries and no roadblocks on building technology. On the other side, what we are increasingly seeing, especially in the tech for good sector, is a big funding crisis where it is not that we do not have these products coming to market. It is not that we are not building solutions that help people. It is just that they are failing essentially to get and sustain funding. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what that looks like on a microcosm level, and also how that kind of plays into what we should expect to see out of the tech for good space. Because even though we have all these people who are empowered to be making more products and potentially be developing and deploying very impactful solutions, essentially we're sending them into a very broken funding landscape that is definitely going to impact what lands in the world for years to come. And so a little bit of a background. Callisto is a nonprofit that I believe was founded in 2014 or 2016. They mentioned in their press release today that they've been around for over 10 years. And one of the very amazing things about Callisto is that they essentially developed a perpetrator matching technology. And so the function of Callisto was essentially a tool for sexual assault victims to go and discuss their assault and to potentially provide identity details about the perpetrator. And their backend essentially would look through all of these assaults and potentially detect serial perpetrators, people who were, you know, doing terrible things at a greater, I don't know how to describe it. They would essentially find people who were assaulting mass amounts of people. And so one of the very interesting things about Callisto is that they always kind of kept this technology private. It was never generally available for consumers, to my knowledge. They did not, sell this to law enforcement. They did not really go the general consumer route. So you yourself probably couldn't go, open Callisto Vault and report and discuss what you were going through. But the way that they did roll out was they worked specifically on local college campuses. For those of you who work in the sexual assault awareness space, you may know that American college campuses are one of the most, unfortunately rampant places to get sexually assaulted or raped. And so in this way, Callisto's model kind of made sense because they were essentially working with an institution that had a problem to essentially make students feel safer and to provide resources. And really just like, it was a very interesting mesh. So as I mentioned, Callisto started at some point in the 2010s. And in 2024, essentially what happened is they almost ran out of money, or I think they were about to run out of money, and they started a crowdfunding campaign and essentially did a very public round of funding through individual donors to essentially save the money to further Callisto's mission and continue doing what they're doing. 2 years later, and essentially as of today, they just announced that they are completely shutting down. And so I have the blog post. Thank you, camera. I have the blog post they wrote right here, and talking. Essentially, I just wanted to talk about it. The way that Callisto frames this is interesting. I don't know, necessarily what to make of it right now, but I think it just resonates highly with what we're seeing in the space, where tech for good solutions are created, they're brought to market, there's initial adoption, there's initial interest, but unfortunately the funding streams are not really set up for these kinds of products. They're not really set up to make, tech products very efficient or very wide scale, and they're kind of artificially limited just by, funding institutions that are usually built for more in-person programs. And so Callisto essentially is talking and saying that they decided to shut down because they were pursuing a significant multi-year grant that was supposed to allow them to move off of college campuses and towards adult survivors through other membership organizations. So essentially their plan was, instead of releasing this information to the general public, we're going to be an enterprise solution, and we're going to go, to YMCA or to these other membership-based programs where people face sexual assault issues, and we're going to sell our software to them or give them our software, and they will distribute it, and they will, manage essentially enforcing justice on the perpetrator, potentially without involving law enforcement. And so what they said is that, this grant that they were doing to essentially expand their program failed, and then in another way they were working to have a separate grant that they cultivated for 2 years that also failed, or didn't fail, but it came in at a small fraction of what they actually needed to continue operation. And so in that sense, they are talking about the fact that, their failure as an organization is related to not just them, but to how sexual assault program funding is allocated overall. They say that the majority of funding for sexual assault cases is committed to trafficking or child sexual abuse. And so in that way, there is no money to be left for adult survivors, or there's less, wiggle room there. And so essentially they're hoping to find a home for the technology and not just shut it down. And, they're giving people back their data. They're doing good sunsetting practices and hygienic, practices in that instance. But essentially what they're saying is, funding for survivors is disappearing, and so therefore, we are too, is essentially their public relations statement. I have some thoughts about this, for lack of a better word. I think first and foremost, outside of any personal thoughts that I have, it is absolutely devastating for any nonprofit to be shutting down right now for any reason. As Callisto kind of alluded to, and as you would probably know if you go online, which if you're watching this video, congratulations. There's been a very massive dearth in funding for nonprofits for various different reasons. Number one, the Trump administration has obviously cut a lot of program funding that both affects, public programs that you've come to know, like government institutions, food stamps, et cetera, but they've also come to cut in at a lot of private funding programs. So especially for nonprofits, there's money that comes in from, individual donations, there's earned revenue, which is they sell their products for X amount. But a very large portion of nonprofits have a very close relationship with the government. And there's this amazing book called Philanthropy in America that I would recommend you guys check out. I'll put a link to it a little bit later. But essentially, the context is that in America, it's different in every country, but especially in the U.S., the government has kind of viewed nonprofit programs in these kind of more private sector, nonprofit organizations that distribute this funding and do these programs as a way to avoid government bloat. So what the government says is that, if we were to handle, managing all of these mental health programs or managing, all of this administration of food stamps funding, that would be very inefficient for us to do. So what instead will happen is we will pay nonprofits and commission nonprofits and give money through grants to essentially trickle down and to act as administrators of this funding and of these resources. So even though the government is not, operating your local homeless shelter directly, or they're not operating, your local eviction assistance program, they are still bankrolling it, heavily involved, still very interfacing with organizations on the ground in that way. And so when the Trump administration cut a lot of this funding, they cut it for government services that were administered, directly by the government, directly by state programs or by county programs. And they also cut a lot of this, trickle down funding. They cut a lot of this research and development funding. They cut a lot of government grant funding. And as a result, unfortunately, more nonprofits are going the private donation route. They're going the private foundation route. And they're essentially trying to, get away from a government funding because in essence, it's inconsistent and we don't know when, if ever, it will come back. And so something that Callisto is alluding to is, we wanted to expand this program, we wanted to continue to do this work, but the funding is just not there. And even when it is there, it is earmarked for these things that are considered to be more flashy, isn't the word I want to say, but I would say more emotionally driven. And so a big issue with any nonprofit programs is obviously when you're appealing to donors or when you're appealing to specific individuals, you are essentially pitching them a cause. So you are saying, how much money do you want to put behind, kittens who need neutering versus how much money do you want to put towards child abuse versus environmental issues versus, humanitarian aid overseas. And so in a lot of this way, nonprofit donor dollars usually falls to nonprofits that have very visceral missions and missions where innocence is very uncomplicated and otherwise unquestioned. And so what I mean in that sense is a lot of humanitarian agencies, when they show the work that they do, they don't particularly show adults from all different kinds of religions and from all different kinds of backgrounds who are experiencing violence and getting help for it. They show, and they typically always focus on children. And that is because, humans have typically agreed that children are collectively innocent. And it's very easy to make a moral case internally on a large scale to protect kids, as opposed to in the Rwandan genocide, where a lot of humanitarian aid was inadvertently going to the people who contributed to that genocide in the first place. So a very big issue with, nonprofit funding in general is that people want to fund stuff that moves them, that makes them feel good about helping, and they often want to fund very visceral or emotionally uncomplicated issues. They don't particularly, want to fund someone's, potential mistake that fell into homelessness, that fell into drug addiction. They want to fund, a child in Africa dying, starving, all of those things. And so in that sense, when nonprofits are forced to move away from government funding, which is supposed to kind of even the playing field, provide money for these things that are less visceral, that are less emotional, but just still need to be done because it is the right thing to do. When these nonprofits move away from that model, we're going to see especially more of what Callisto is experiencing, where these programs where it can help people and there is potential gain to be made, we're just not necessarily going to see the amount of, for lack of better word, consistency in funding as we've historically seen. And so this especially affects tech for good products in a couple of specific ways. Number one, software development is just cheaper when it reaches more people. It is often easier to build more broad products than it is to build niche products that have less of an ROI. It's very hard to build broad technology solutions that focus on all of these different issues and also get funding for it. And so part of what Callisto was saying was, we built this solution, and not just for college students who have faced sexual assault, but also for these member populations that have also experienced sexual assault. And so in that way, there's a fundamental tension at the heart of Tech for Good funding that we're going to see, because so much of what funding is probably going to move to are these more visceral emergency, last minute worst case scenarios. And unfortunately, a lot of what software for social good is great at is, building these broader solutions that are able to address more issues in a bit more of a fluid and flexible way. And essentially that is just not what funding is currently built for. It's very hard also to, I think, bring these solutions to market more than it has been, because a lot of foundations donors, just really anybody who gives money away freely, they want to see proof of efficacy before they ever fund anything like that. And so, unfortunately, we're also going to see less experimental programs that are building technology for these kinds of things. We'll probably see more, going back to the concept that generative AI is very adept at enabling accessibility of building these code bases. We're probably going to see a lot of these programs come out, potentially get initial traction, but we're going to see more continue to fail and die in the actual process of coming to market and being adopted and experiencing longevity as an organization. And something else that Callisto is reminding me of is the crisis text line scandal that happened a couple years ago at this point. For those of you that don't know, Crisis Text Line is a text line, essentially. You text some kind of keyword to 741741, and essentially their service pairs you with a trained crisis counselor who will listen to you, who will be there for you, potentially provide resources to you, and so on. And so to me, Crisis Text Line does count as a software company, and they have been a little bit more forward-facing in their technologies than other hotline organizations have been. And so one of the very interesting things about Crisis Text Line is because it's all text-based. It's not necessarily, you're calling someone. They have an absolute monolith of all of this data about users, what they're saying, what they're experiencing, and the different outcomes that they end up having. And so essentially, Crisis Text Line, I forget what they called it, but they essentially open sourced a data commons. And they were able to say, when we have suicidal users or we have users that are going through a crisis, these are the keywords that are most likely to actually match up with the severity of an issue. So, actually when you text crisis hotline or Crisis Text Line suicide, that is severe, but it's not as severe as if you texted the text line, CVS or ibuprofen or something else that indicates active intent. And so Crisis Text Line over the years has been able to build a very prolific database, essentially, of, keywords that essentially enable them to determine with pretty good accuracy how much of a situation the person messaging them is in, right? When you think about a text line, there's a finite amount of volunteers, and you often have to triage these users and essentially say, user A is more suicidal than user C, and user B is pretty okay. And so they use what this information is to, what I believe is triage, and then to actually escalate the pathways that users go through as they're talking to volunteers, and the resources that they eventually end up with. And so a very big scandal that happened with Crisis Text Line is that they took the data that they gathered from talking to people in crisis, and they essentially created a for-profit spin-off of their company, I think called Loris. I forget exactly what it is. It was something Loris, Lauren, etc., etc. So they created a for-profit spin-off of a product with this crisis data that was meant for customer service chatbots. So essentially, they took Crisis Text Line data, they turned it into a customer service chatbot. Ethical issues abound. The founder and the executive director, Nancy Lublin, was outed from the organization for that and for other reasons. But essentially, all of this just goes to show that building a tech for good product, it's not really even about the barrier to having a good idea. It is not the lack of good ideas. It is not the lack of, initiative to bring them to market. It is just this, funding like, I don't know, this funding infrastructure that is fundamentally incompatible with these technical products in some sense. And I think it's still a very open question as to, you know, how do we fund this stuff? How do we actually keep it in the market over time? How do we ensure longevity of these products so that they can stay and essentially do what they were designed to do? But most importantly, how do we do it at scale, right? I think it would be fair to say that it's pretty sad that Callisto's technology just landed on college campuses and it never went farther. I think if you were to talk to a regular person and you were to say, you know, there was an invention where people were able to take their sexual assaults and they were able to put them in a database that was able to detect serial perpetrators, I think that would make a lot of people feel very comfortable, especially, you know, given all of the news about all of the different pedophiles and sexual assaulters and just crazy shit that's been coming out recently. I think the average person would rightly say, oh my God, that's a great idea. Why is this not everywhere? Why have I not heard of it? Why is it not being adopted in law enforcement? You know, essentially, this is so crazy. Why is it not everywhere? And I think we're going to unfortunately see a lot more of that given, you know, all of these cuts to the nonprofit sector, given the fact that we're kind of all now, you know, competing essentially for private donor money, private foundation money, and also given the fact that there's going to be probably a lot more social good and tech for good apps coming in the space in the future. I think there's still some other questions just in regards to, you know, what does it mean to essentially, I don't know. I'll put a pin in it, but essentially I do also have questions for Callisto's leadership in the sense where it's like, if you miss one grant to expand and then you miss another that was just managing programmatic expenses, it didn't seem to me like the organization was in good financial shape regardless of what happened. And I think it's a little bit, maybe disingenuous is the right word, but I think the idea, I don't know. I just struggle with the concept of we are shutting down our organization and we are throwing it on the funders, because legitimately there's really been not that much happening, unfortunately, with Callisto's expansion and their growth. And I'm sure it is a chicken and egg situation. But also I do have to question, like, if your organization was almost shut down 2 years ago and it is shut down now because you missed, you know, 2 funding opportunities, I kind of have questions about the fundamental model that was operating there, for lack of a better word. But I think it's very easy to sit and throw stones at a glass house when you don't have to, unfortunately, you know, be in that glass house. And so for that, I'll save my judgments. But essentially, I did just want to talk and make a little video ramble about this because it's very sad. Callisto was an organization that started a little bit before the time when I started my own organization, which also died from lack of funding. And so in that way, it is close to my heart, and it's definitely on my mind, especially considering that there's just so many cases of sexual predators, and there's so many questions about how are we going to reform the justice system, what are we going to do to stop these people who are, you know, inherently so powerful and ruining the lives of so many. And there was an organization with very promising technology that, you know, legitimately had a way to solve this issue, and they just shut down due to lack of funding. And so regardless of that, it's very sad, and I think we'll continue to see more tech for good funding issues, unfortunately, in the future. And hopefully we'll figure it out. But that is all. Just wanted to say hey, wanted to talk about that. I'll link the book that I was discussing and also Callisto's press release below. But I hope you guys are having a good day. Stay safe, stay funded, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Okay, bye.